afternoon. Hope you and your families are all well. My name is Kaveh Khoshnood. I'm an associate professor at Yale School of Public Health, and I would like to thank the Yale Council on Middle East Studies for organizing this event and inviting me to be the moderator for this panel. I have been traveling to Lebanon for about a decade and have had the pleasure and privilege of collaborating with colleagues at the American University of Beirut, the Lebanese American University, public health officials, and several civil society organizations on a number of public health projects. I find Lebanese people to be kind, generous, smart, and resilient, and I often think of Lebanon as my second home. As mentioned on the flyer for this event, this past year has been a particularly tough period for Lebanon. The country has experienced major economic, political, and public health challenges. Just about a year ago, on October 17, 2019, the Lebanese cabinet announced new tax measures to address an economic crisis. In response, tens of thousands of peaceful protesters took to the streets across the country, calling for their social economic rights, for accountability, an end to corruption, and the resignation of all political representatives. Shortly after, the cabinet resigned, but many of the ruling figures remained in power. In January of this year, a new cabinet was appointed with little change to address the population's demands, and the protests continued. According to a report by Amnesty International, on August 4th of this year, an explosion at the port of Beirut killed at least 190 people, injured more than 6,500, and left around 300,000 people homeless. The blast was caused by close to 3 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been stored unsafely in a warehouse. This tragic event, against the backdrop of a global pandemic and financial and political crises, reignited the October protests on 8th of August with calls for accountability and justice. The new protests resulted in the resignation of the cabinet for the second time. Our panel today coincides with a 100-year celebration of the establishment of Greater Lebanon, and we are fortunate to have 3 distinguished panelists who will share their perspectives on the future of Lebanon with us. I'd like to start with a brief introduction of our distinguished panelists. Sally Abi Khalil is the country director of Oxfam in Lebanon and a World Fellow at Yale. She's currently in Lebanon. Sally is a humanitarian and development practitioner with 20 years of experience in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria. As the first Lebanese woman to run a major NGO within the Syria Response to Lebanon, she has led humanitarian response programming, supporting youth and women with social innovation and social entrepreneurship initiatives, promoted the right to decent work, worked for the establishment of civil society networks, and promoted feminist approaches towards leadership and collective action. Next, Professor Teresa Chahine is the Sheila and Ron Marcelo Senior Lecturer in Social Entrepreneurship at the Yale School of Management. Professor Chahine is the author of Introduction to Social Entrepreneurship, a 12-step framework for building impactful ventures in new and existing organizations. Dr. Shahine's research focuses on developing tools to characterize and advance social and environmental determinants of health. She launched the first social entrepreneurship program in the context of public health at Harvard University. She was also responsible for launching the first venture philanthropy organization in her home country of Lebanon, providing tailored financing and critical management support to social enterprises serving marginalized populations through education and job creation for youth and women. Professor Khalil Gebara is a professor of economics at Lebanese American University and a senior policy fellow at Issam Fares Institute at the American University of Beirut. Professor Khalil is an expert in governance, local development, and public policy, with a unique set of expertise as a researcher, academic, and government advisor. He's currently teaching economics at Lebanese American University. Between February 2014 and February 2019, he was the Policy and International Affairs Advisor to the Minister of Interior and Municipalities. And between 2010 and 2014, he served as the head of the Good Governance Unit at the Office of Prime Minister Saad Hariri. In December 2008, he was appointed by the Lebanese government as a member of the first Supervisory Commission on the Election Campaign. Professor Khalil was also the director of the Lebanese Transparency Association between 2005 and 2008. The format for today's panel is as follows. I will start the discussion with a few questions from our panelists and then open it up for a question and answer session, and then end with the last question from the panelists. You could send your questions to the Q&A that you see in the bottom of your screen. So just to get started, I would like to ask each panelist to share a few minutes summary of what they're working on right now with respect to the economic, political, and public health crisis in Lebanon. Sally, if you could please start, and then we can move to Khalil and then Teresa.
Thank you, Kaveh, so much for the introduction, and thank you to the Yale Council for Middle East Studies for hosting this panel. As Oxfam, we've been working in Lebanon since 1993, mainly to address poverty, inequality, and vulnerability in the country, but also to respond to the multitude of crises that the country has faced and continues to face in present day. We scaled up largely our presence in Lebanon in response to the Syria crisis in 2011 and the massive influx of refugees into the country. As you may know, currently Lebanon hosts the largest number of refugees per capita in the world. 1 in 4 people is a refugee. Our humanitarian assistance to the Syria crisis mainly entails providing water, sanitation, hygiene responses to Syrian refugees living in informal tented settlements in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, and also focuses on community-based protection work with the communities themselves and with local partners to address issues around protection that they may be facing, whether it is legal, such as birth registration, residency status, among other things, LGBT case, and as well as sexual and gender-based violence case management. In March of this year, we also launched a massive COVID response in Lebanon in the respective areas where we're working. And this included distribution of soap, hygiene kits, infection and prevention kits to Syrian refugees specifically, as well as large-scale awareness campaign around what is COVID-19, how do you protect yourself from it, and how do you protect others in your community, as well as what would you do if you suspect someone is infected. When it comes to the economic crisis in Lebanon, Oxfam is working with businesses to stay afloat in this very challenging time, to protect people's jobs, as well as to try and invest in creating the minimal amount of jobs that we can in such a dire economic situation, and supporting social entrepreneurs and what is now emerging as a solidarity economy in the country. Other initiatives include cash for work and temporary cash assistance to address socio-economic shocks, such as a social safety net, while also engaging at the macro level in the establishment of comprehensive social protection framework for Lebanon, which currently does not exist. In response to the Beirut blast of August 4th, we're working with several local organizations to address and support people's needs to manage such an intense and traumatic shock and the crisis that they are currently facing. This includes psychosocial support, shelter, cash assistance, specifically to the most vulnerable communities and sometimes, unfortunately, forgotten communities, such as migrant workers, women, and the LGBTQ community. And finally, when it comes to good governance, Oxfam takes a role as a convener to provide technical support, financial opportunities, and an influencing platforms for active members of the community to hold decision makers accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Khalil, we next turn to you. If you can tell us in a few minutes, what is it that you're working on? You're muted, I think.
I think this is, you are muted, I think is the key word. Thank you, Kaveh, for your introduction, and thanks for the Council on Middle East Studies for this invitation. And you said it right. We, as whoever is Lebanese today involved in public policy, after 100 years of the establishment of Lebanon, many are involved in different initiatives and working closely on a lot of things related to the current status of Lebanon. You know, Kaveh, Lebanon is crumbling, if you want to put it like that, if you don't want to use the word melting down. So crumbling or melting down. The economic system, what Lebanon has been known for forever, which is a free market, the role of private sector, and very competitive service sector based on banking and finance, already crumbled with, now we have, what is left of is a number of what we call them in economic or finance zombie banks. At the same time, you have a political system that is unable to generate reforms and unable to respond to people's needs and demand. And on the top of all of that, you are in a regional context, highly competitive with a lot of internal intra-competition and different type of agendas and orientations and tracks. So you are in a very difficult situation where you have an overlapped economic, political, regional order that are all interlinked to each other. And on the top of all of that, you are hit like everywhere else in the world with a very severe pandemic that also is exposing all the weaknesses of a health sector and education sector at the same time, that rested forever on the role of the private sector and philanthropic organization, whereas the state did not play a pivotal role. So this is this summary says that says it all. As Sally was talking about different and Oxfam initiatives, I mean, I personally, I am involved for some time now in a lot of initiatives and efforts that works on something we are calling it Rethinking Lebanon, which is a new political platform for Lebanon. We believe that, we believe that reforms should be driven from inside, which is, and based on what we have seen, observed from the two waves of the Arab Spring, the first wave, which is hit by Syria, Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia, and the second wave, the recent one, especially Sudan and Algeria. So we are working on this platform for change in Lebanon that rests mostly on a reconfiguration of the Lebanese constitution and improvement of the institutions, and discussing a lot of the conflicting issues related to the role of Lebanon in the regional order, neutrality of Lebanon in terms of the regional order, the role of sect and confessions. You have been to Lebanon, so you know this debate about the role of sects and confessions in the Lebanese political system. So I'm involved in on the track of political reforms, trying to rethink of a new Lebanon. And this is especially that we finished the first 100 years, and we are hoping this will generate something for the future. At the same time, I am part of a group of experts that is managed by the UN ESCWA, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Southern Asia, that we are working on Lebanon economic and social challenges. Because as I said, the Lebanese economic model crumbled. And we can talk later a lot about it. And also the inability of the Lebanese government to come up with solutions to the economic crisis. And recently, I am part of AUB, Issam Fares Institute, and other scholars at AUB. We launched the Crisis Observatory, which is monitor all the tensions, whether socio-economic tensions in Lebanon, regarding resulting from the economic crisis that affects Lebanese and also affect other vulnerable groups, whereas Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, and other domestic workers. And recently, part of this observatory, we launched also the Recovery and Reconstruction Monitor, where we are monitoring all the efforts, whether civil society efforts, private sector, international or national, that are working on after the blast of 4th of August, the explosion, and we are calling it the recovery. And we are doing this as partnership with a wide range of Lebanese CSOs, including Lebanese Transparency International and the mother umbrella, which is Transparency International. Lastly, and sorry if I took some time, we, again, as terms of public policy, I'm following closely the Lebanese government response to COVID-19, especially in terms of the response plan. And we have been engaged in a lot of discussions and argument and counter-argument with Lebanese health officials and others regarding to the way they are reacting to the efforts and the steps taken to respond to this crisis, especially in terms of management of the crisis, the governance aspects of the crisis, like recently how they are recording them, from recording the number of positive cases into where the money is going towards which kind of public hospitals, and the difference between private hospital and public hospital. So this is these are currently the 4 things that I am focusing on.
Thank you so much, Khalil. Teresa, we will next turn to you.
Thank you, Kaveh. It's truly an honor to be here with Sally and Khalil, who have spent decades doing this work before everybody else realized that it was needed and was talking about how much it's needed. And I feel especially privileged to have witnessed their work for the past several decades, and yours as well. We first met in Lebanon on one of your visits. So my work in the response has been twofold. On the public health front, yes, it's important to invest in the Ministry of Public Health and in the public health infrastructure. And it's also important to invest in the institutions that will hold the government accountable through research, data collection, and convening stakeholders across sectors. So I've had the privilege to work with Dr. Ghada Fleihan at the American University of Beirut. She's the founder of the SHARP program, Scholars in Health Research, and a double alumna of the American University of Beirut and the School of Public Health where I studied, which I was told when I joined Yale never to mention by name. So let's just say that there's another School of Public Health other than Yale, and that all the double alumni of that school and of AUB have been working together for the past 2 months in order to think about how to mobilize resources for AUB, because not only COVID, but future public health crises need to ensure that we have scholars and practitioners who are trained in providing healthcare, public health, and leadership. AUB has lost a lot of resources since the economic collapse, and Ghada's mission has been to make sure that people who want to work in medicine and public health will have opportunities for training, research, and capacity building. So it's been truly a privilege to work with that. Now, in terms of Al-Fanar, the organization that I launched in Lebanon, it's the first venture philanthropy organization in the Arab world and had been working in Egypt before I had the opportunity to connect and get it started in Lebanon. We work with small, medium, and high net worth philanthropists, individuals, family, corporates, foundations, and larger institutions, for them to pool their capital to direct it strategically towards sustainable change in the Middle East. And we do so by providing tailored financing and, more critically, non-financial management support to ambitious social entrepreneurs who have come up with innovative, growing, and financially sustainable solutions to some deep market failures, and who need long-term funding, management support, data analytics to grow and professionalize. So our theory of change is related to strengthening civil society, not in order to create parallel systems, not because we believe civil society should be doing everything because the government isn't, but because we believe that without a strong middle class, there's nobody to hold the government accountable. And so when the Beirut blast hit, we had to ask ourselves, as social investors, what is our role in a humanitarian catastrophe? And we realized that over years of funding and management support to ambitious social enterprises, there were remarkable, effective, professional organizations that we could not only support to respond to frontline needs, but that we could help create much needed work at a time when Lebanon is passing through the worst economic crisis in its history. And so we've been focusing on 3 areas. The first is food assistance. We put out an emergency Lebanon appeal to mobilize our network of philanthropists to provide food assistance through 4 social enterprises that we've either funded or trained. The second is Reconstruction. We expedited due diligence on a new social enterprise into our pipeline after the blast. It's Bedco by March NGO. It helps disadvantaged youth secure regular employment by training them and connecting them to construction jobs. So we're working with Bedco providing regular jobs as we repair 100 social enterprises and small businesses in Gemeze, Marm Khalil, and Karantina. And thirdly, and most importantly, supporting social enterprises, because the economic crisis, COVID-19, and the blast taught us to double down on our mission to improve equity through social enterprise. And that when you invest patiently and strategically to grow, professionalize, and make sustainable, ambitious social enterprises, they will be standing and ready to not only respond in crisis, but to build the future, something Lebanon needs now more than ever.
Thank you so much. Well, you all have a lot going on. Thank you for being on this panel. I want to next ask you from your own individual perspective about the response from the international community to the current crisis in Lebanon. You can, again, use your own perspective to answer. Who would like to go first? Maybe Khalil, if you want to give sort of the big picture, macros or economic, political response from the international community.
Thank you, Kaveh. I think that if you want to start for the Lebanese observers, especially outside Lebanon, different generations witnessed different type of international community interest into Lebanon. The generations of the 60s and 70s witnessed Lebanon to be an exceptional example into a regional environment, whereas either based on centralized systems with a system that had freedom and the rights and the elections and former president, which was something in exception in the Middle East, especially the Arab part of the Middle East. The generations of the 80s witnessed wars, invasions, kidnapping of foreign hostages, assassinations of the president of the American University of Beirut, and the explosion of the College Hall building, the first building at AUB. And the post-90s generation witnessed economic plans. We had Paris I economic, the first economic conference to support Lebanon, Paris I, Paris II. And recently, basically, we had Sadr. And recently, after the explosion, the French president also called for a virtual conference for humanitarian support to Lebanon. So what this chronological image saying that international committee has always been present when it comes to Lebanon challenges. Remember that we have international peacekeepers in the south. Yesterday, the United Nations with the American State Department were part of the first of the negotiations regarding the demarcation of maritime borders. And with the assassination of the Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, we had international tribunal. So the international community is always present when it comes to Lebanon. The way the Lebanese, though, perceive this presence and this involvement was what was basically the real issue and the real diversion and the real divisions between the people for the past decades. So I cannot say that the international community was not present in Lebanon, but what I can say for sure is that the Lebanese perceive this presence and this intervention in different lands, and this is what makes Lebanese problems more unique and difficult than others, which is that you don't have national issues. they are being perceived from either a community or political alienations angle. So for example, the French president, when he visited Lebanon a few days after the explosion, he spoke about the need for a new social contract for Lebanon. But then when you really, for the ones who studied Middle East political history and knows about Lebanese political system, there is no social contract in Lebanon. The contract is between the Lebanese and its community rather than between the Lebanese and the state. So this is what makes Lebanon difficult, and this is what makes people like myself, Sally and Teresa and others working hard is convergence of different Lebanese priorities and present your own priority agenda towards the international community rather than rely on the international community to impose its own set of values, agendas, and priorities. And this has been our biggest challenge for the past years and decade. And but that's one. At the same time, and what we saw after the explosion of the 4th of August, we have seen much more willingness from the international community to support humanitarian support and in recovery, but not through direct channeling to the Lebanese state institutions. So again, one features for the ones interested to take this debate into much more comparative angle is that we are talking now about a blast, which is maybe the biggest explosion, non-nuclear explosion in the world, where recovery is being driven by local organizations and international NGOs and personal initiatives. So you are talking about maybe the first privatized recovery and reconstruction efforts in the past years, and this is something interesting that you don't have a nationally driven reconstruction that looks at urban planning, at preservation of cultural heritage, or launch a discussion about the role, for example, of Beirut Port in terms of trade and and how it's useful for Syria, Iraq, and other countries. So this is today the very interesting feature is what I said is a privatization, if you don't want to say use different terms, of the reconstruction and recovery. At the same time,
honestly is so similar to the way that the reconstruction and recovery took place after the Civil War.
Yeah, but after the Civil War, Teresa, there was a recovery and reconstruction plan was driven mostly infrastructure by economic and by national councils and public institutions. Now the state is totally absent. State institutions are absent, and the municipality of Beirut is also absent. So whether at the level of national and local, you have the state basically withdraw. Today we have a withdrawal of the state in Lebanon. So who is filling this vacuum? Filling this vacuum are initiative, whether personal, private sector, NGOs, international organizations. Sally mentioned what they are doing. This is something similar to the way the Lebanese government withdrew from responding to the Syrian refugee crisis. And currently, and we can see also in terms of how they are responding to COVID-19 by simply asking the Lebanese to stay at home, but because they have no ability to invest in hospitalization and in public health infrastructure. So the idea is lock people at home because there are no hospital beds. So there is a trend over the past 2 3 years, which I consider to be very dangerous, which is a total withdrawal of the state. And you know, in political theory, political science, when the state withdraws itself from its functions, it becomes not useful. It doesn't have any more an added value for citizens. Hence, you see more and more people demands for the destruction of the regime and state, because the state itself as legitimacy is what it provides to the people. When it doesn't provide, the state doesn't have any more legitimacy. So the international community has had a constant messaging toward the Lebanese government. And yesterday, I'm sorry if I took time, yesterday the director of the IMF made a very interesting comment when she was asked about support to the Lebanese government regarding the because of the economic crisis. She said it very clearly, we need 2 to tango. We are ready to support, but we don't have a national partner that is interested in reforms and issues like that. So the international community has the international support group. It's a group of countries at the UN plus the IMF and the World Bank. They formed the international support group for Lebanon. They meet regularly. They provide advice. So the interest of the international community is there. The willingness to, is there. I think what's missing is the other side on the table, which is the Lebanese side. And if you follow current news, the way the inability to form a government or to agree on or to designate a prime minister, and how political parties are still seeing things from the lens of their own political interest, show that how difficult it is to expect a national response to all of these challenges that we all have been talking about it for the past 15, 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Khalil. Sally, your perspective on how the international community has responded.
Yeah, I keep having trouble also unmuting. So really how the international community views the Lebanese state, just to build upon what Khalil has been saying, was laid bare after the August 4th explosion. Because as Khalil said, this aid was deliberately funneled away from the government to local actors, from NGOs to international NGOs to the UN itself. And we can really consider this justifiable, particularly given the Lebanese state's response to the blast itself. It was so dismal, both on a symbolic and practical level. On a symbolic level, there was a complete absence of senior state officials visiting the blast site itself in the immediate aftermath. There was no government-led response. There was no true national mourning, basically no national leadership of any kind that one would expect in such a traumatic disaster. And more practically, the Lebanese government failed to even deploy any resources it has, such as the massive security forces at its hands to help in the aftermath of the blast. The Lebanese army was deployed, but to secure the blast site itself and the city, which was declared a disaster zone. And what we witnessed is the Lebanese army sitting on the sidelines of the street, watching volunteers, individuals who came down to Beirut, to the streets with their brooms, and garbage bags to clean up their own neighborhoods and other people's neighborhoods. More broadly, the international community since 2018 has been very clear to link any financial support to Lebanon's structural issues to reform. And this includes measures to address rampant corruption that's in the country and waste. The electricity grid situation is one of the most obvious and prominent item on the to-do list. For those of you that don't know, since the end of the civil war in 1993, Lebanon still cannot provide 24-hour electricity to its people. The international community, which, as Khalil alluded to and explained, once helped bankroll the Lebanese state in the post-war era with a series of these donor conferences. But this time, they have refused to do so on the grounds that the reforms pledged in previous conferences were never implemented. They probably believe maybe too many chances have been given now, and that, but what in essence they actually really believe is that this time around, they are convinced that any support channeled to the Lebanese state is like pouring money into a black hole. So this very strong conditionality feature is a new position that the international community has very clearly vocalized since 2018. And in pressing these demands for reforms in Lebanon, foreign governments such as the US and France have also pointed to the demands voiced during the popular uprising in October 17th of last year. So we're almost 1 year now since this Thawra or revolution started, where masses of people took to the streets demanding an end to corruption, to good governance, demanding good governance, a merit-based and competent-driven government, and early elections. And calling for a government that has the capacity and the will to address the collapsing economy and implemented these needed reforms, but from a social justice lens. And just to sort of put it in context, this failing economy, this financial crisis that we keep talking about, And to put it into sort of perspective, poverty rates in Lebanon are expected to jump from 28% in 2019 to 55% as of May 2020. So the number is now actually higher. And these figures come from UNESCO. So extreme poverty has risen from 8% to 23% in the last year. And in terms of, to put it even more clearly, in terms of number of individuals, this is a rise from 1.1 million people under, in extreme poverty to 2.7 million in extreme poverty. So the Beirut blast and the response to it is illustrative of a wider picture of state failure since the end of the civil war in Lebanon, where the government has failed to take on any responsibility towards crises the country has faced or is facing, and towards its own people and various communities on its territory. So we've talked a lot about the failure to respond to the Beirut blast as an example, but just to build upon the other two examples that Khalil just mentioned. So the Syria response, when we had millions of Syrian refugees flee war in neighboring Syria to seek refuge in Lebanon, the Lebanese government's policy was one of no policy. They put their hands up and said, this is not our problem, this is the international community's problem, and you deal with it, you finance it. COVID response, also, in addition to what Khalil said of just telling people to stay home and locking down, the government didn't want to pay for any form of response, and again went to the international community, to the WHO, to UNICEF and other UN actors, asking them to bankroll isolation centers, especially on the refugee front, and propping up hospitals, and all without any responsibility on its part. So this really points to a state that is unwilling and unable to carry out basic functions of governance, from basic assistance to crisis management and response to necessary reform, meeting its own international obligations. And yet again, looking for international actors to respond and bankroll. But what we are seeing is this limit, this sort of enough is enough, a message that is finally now coming from the international community. Over.
Thank you, Sally. Teresa.
So in terms of humanitarian response, we're seeing philanthropically and private sector institutions being very responsive in terms of, okay, how can we help short term? But in terms of long-term development, there's really just a waiting room right now where multilateral institutions like the World Bank are just waiting to know who to tango with, as Khalil said. So I'll keep it concise in terms of that's the response that we've observed, and then we can talk more about what we would expect, which is, I think, your next question.
You're on mute, Kaveh.
Sorry. I do have a number of other questions, but I want to be respectful of the people who I see they're submitting questions. So if you don't mind, we're going to switch to the questions that are coming in through the questions and answer. And then if there's time allows, I'm going to go back to some of the other questions. Are you able to see the questions? Sally, I see the first questions for you. You mentioned solidarity economy. Lucia was asking if you could talk a little more about what that is, who participates in solidarity economy, how does it manifest itself, how much money circulates in the economic space.
Thank you, Lucia, for that question. So, as we've been discussing now for half an hour, the failure of the Lebanese state within a context of a failure of an economic system and a financial banking system that has collapsed. So people used to depend on an economy that generates jobs, that sort of circulates money and generates growth, and a financial system, a banking system that allows people to go to the bank to access loans, be it personal loans to buy a house or a car or whatever, or business loans to open up your own business and to be entrepreneurial, again, within an economy that is supposed to function. But within this collapse, you have a negative growth economy, one that's collapsing, as we've said, and a banking sector that has collapsed. Technically not collapsed because the banks still exist, but we call them zombie banks. So they're still there, but people have absolutely no access to their money. You know, so and we've seen the Lebanese pound crash and lose about 80% of its value. With rampant inflation, Lebanon is number 2 in the highest inflation in the world after Zimbabwe and before Venezuela. So what we're seeing is people taking their own initiatives, taking matters into their own hands to address this situation. And this is what we're calling a solidarity economy. So you're seeing once again the rise of cooperatives. So you know, again, the shift from a very sort of capitalist neoliberal model to a model that is where people associate together voluntarily in a flat structure to address their sort of social, economic, and even cultural needs in a democratic fashion. So what we mean on the solidarity economy is this people's initiatives to come together, you know, such as in formats such as cooperatives, be it women's cooperatives or agricultural cooperatives or youth cooperatives, to support each other and you know, to give each other access to necessary means to be able to carry on, be it in such a very challenging and economic time. And how much money circulates in this economic space, it's very hard to quantify it. Because this, you know, cooperatives always existed in Lebanon, but they've been dormant for a very long time. And so we're seeing both the re-emergence of those dormant cooperatives, as well as new initiatives, including purely financial cooperatives, where people are lending each other money as well to support each other for through this situation. And as Oxfam, what we've been trying to do is to see how we can, you know, sort of support this space and be it, you know, technically or otherwise, to support these initiatives that have emerged, to really, you know, support this solidarity that has organically emerged in this last period. And this predates the blast. This really started as of last year when sort of the financial collapse started to happen. Over.
Thank you, Sally. Khalil, there was a question for you about this notion of rethinking Lebanon. What options for political change are you promoting? Abolishing seats by sect in the parliament, etc. So you can see the question.
Yes. Yes, thank you. I saw the question, and it's an opportunity. I don't know personally Lucia, but the one who asked the questions, but I read her book about the memories and memorials of in Lebanon, and my answer for that is that, as I said, you know, when the French president visited Lebanon, spoke about a new social contract or social pact, for Lebanon, where we don't have, right? And today, the real debate, if you want to move on to political reforms, is that from 1975, I counted them, until the Taif Agreement of 1989, the agreement that took place in the Saudi city of Taif that called the National Pact Agreement, many initiatives took place to end the Lebanese civil war and to reform the political system. The Taif Agreement came as a formula that brings together everyone on board. So it left a lot of things, like many similar peace agreements in divided communities, left a lot of things that vague. So today, there are things that requires in Lebanon, and this is where the crisis the crisis or the problems emerge. There is a lot of vague ideas mentioned in the Lebanese constitution. And at the same time, because of the nature of the economic system, which is a power sharing system, you ended up with outside the institutions formula of representative of major political parties and sects. They agree on things, and institutions became simply the venue to legalize these type of agreements that were taking place outside the institutions, the constitutional institutions. So the ideas that we are bringing to the table is that we need to bring back the debate to within the institutions rather than outside the institutions. As this is the major idea, which is something that doesn't exist in the Lebanon and the region, which is the respect to the culture of a constitution or agreements, such agreements. The main focus, my main research interest personal, is on three things: a new electoral law, which is, I believe, that needs to take into consideration two other things together. One, an enlarged decentralization mechanism to ensure accountability at the local level and bottom-up approach of accountability. And at the same time, we need what was mentioned in the constitution but never implemented, in a Senate. A Senate existed in Lebanon briefly in 1926 during the French mandate, then it was abolished, but then was brought back to the constitution in 1989. And the idea of the Senate is to keep the executive and the legislative branches for generation of policies and decision making, and export all the other issues that affect the communities and the minorities and the sects in Lebanon into a third institution that we're going to call it Senate. So I think I look at it about a three angles reform package that includes the Senate, a new electoral law, and decentralization. So the answer to the question, you cannot really talk about abolishing sectarianism in Lebanon, as also mentioned in the constitution, without providing guarantees to different sectarian groups, especially to minorities. And something about this region, whether we agree, whether we find it, is that there has minorities in some places has been prosecuted, and in other places, majorities has been prosecuted for the sake of minorities. So protection of rights should be ensured by constitution and by the Senate, and at the same time unleash the executive and the legislative so they can provide services to the public and to respond and to be accountable to the people. And this is why I'm focusing about the three basically together. I see them, they go hand in hand. You cannot have one before the other, which are decentralization, electoral law, and a new Senate, or the establishment of a Senate.
Thank you. Teresa, the next question is for you about venture philanthropy and how does it exactly work?
So I'll try to link it more to the context of the role that it could play here. I'll spend like 30 seconds clarifying for those who aren't familiar with the term. Venture philanthropy is a way of deploying philanthropic funds that applies private sector approaches to systematically assess, measure, and make decisions about which organizations to invest in based on the social return of investments. What will be the social impact of deploying these philanthropic funds, which is different from traditional philanthropy that can just be like guided by the heartstrings. And it does have a very important role to play in development and potentially in this situation. One way is through public-private partnerships. And another way is through social impact bonds. So I'll spend a few moments talking about each. To set the stage though, I'll mention the context in which we practice venture philanthropy has always been thinking long-term about where do social entrepreneurs and social enterprises fit in within the larger picture of strengthening systems. Because a huge criticism of social entrepreneurship is that it builds parallel systems, which, as Khalil mentioned, is a huge risk in Lebanon when you're asking the citizen to step up and do something simply because the government has failed to do it. Yes, that has huge potential, but then it also just has huge risk that you're no longer holding the government accountable. And so we've selected the organizations that we support because of the work that they're doing vis-a-vis the government. Our first investment in Lebanon was an education investment that had already been working with the Ministry of Education and with CERD, the Center for Education Research and Development, I think that's what it stands for, that was responsible for teacher training curriculum, to try and reform the teacher training curriculum. And our second one was the same, but involved in later stages of education and had also been meeting with the minister. And so we chose them on purpose because we felt that they could work synergistically, and that strength was in numbers when trying to put pressure on the government. So where does venture philanthropy come in to rebuilding Lebanon, and how in a way that can hold the government accountable? This is why I mentioned social impact bonds, because it's one of the few vehicles for social financing that creates a link between social entrepreneurs and governments. And the strength of social entrepreneurs is that they're able to take risks in testing what works. Governments cannot. Governments need to be very risk averse. But when the landscape is ripe for innovation and for testing out what works, that's where social entrepreneurs step in. And when they're able to generate evidence and proof of concept about new initiatives, programs, products, and services that can have a huge social return on investment, then social impact bonds are a way to fund the government in order to work with social entrepreneurs to scale these new programs. And it's a way for the private sector to front the money that's needed to implement these programs, and for the government to pay them back once the results are achieved. So it's really all based on having evidence that links these programs, products, or services to results. So that's one financial vehicle that we have not tested yet in Lebanon, but has been tested in many countries around the world, both low and middle income countries and higher income countries. And more broadly speaking, I'll speak a little bit to my work at Yale on public-private partnerships as part of the Global Health Leadership Initiative, which trains leaders in health around the world, and which we've been trying to apply for grants with the AUB team with to implement some kind of program there. We've done research on public-private partnerships that are not just two partners, that are multiple partners. So to give one example, because it's super controversial, as is the situation, we evaluated a partnership in sub-Saharan Africa based on the adage that you can get a Coca-Cola in every village in Africa, but you can't get access to basic essential medicines. And so the Coca-Cola company partnered with the Ministry of Health and with USAID and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Accenture Development Partners. So it was a multi-stakeholder partnership to try and see how they could strengthen the supply chain, logistics, and distribution of the Ministry of Health. In many sub-Saharan African countries, Tanzania is the one that I was involved in evaluating, in South Africa, and Eswatini most recently. And one of the things we looked at was, how do you build trust in these partnerships? In some cases, it was trust for the private sector partner, like Coca-Cola in a public health context. And in many cases, it was trust for the government. When we surveyed stakeholders and interviewed stakeholders, it depended on the context, but some people said, I trust the public sector way more than I trust the government. At least I can see that they get results. And so we found, based on our research, that there were 4 main factors that influence trust in public-private partnerships. And I think that if multilateral funders and development organizations and civil or private partners in Lebanon want to work with the government in a partnership, it is possible to structure it so that you can actively build trust for these partnerships. So to use really simplified terms, our observations were that results matter, alignment of goals matter, people matter, and context matters, and that these things all evolve over time and are really underpinned by strong communications. So in terms of results matter, it's about starting small. Where can we actually achieve tangible results? Because sometimes the situation can just seem so overwhelming and you don't even know where to start. And especially in a situation like this, where it's going to take decades to see results, can we partner on something smaller that we could achieve small wins on and start building trust on? Alignment of goals matters, because so many times in public-private partnerships, it's hard to succeed because people have different incentives, especially the private sector in redeveloping Lebanon right now. And so how can we choose partners whose incentives and goals going into this are really aligned, and how do you determine that? People matter. This means that the actual individuals working on the partnership make a huge difference, because it's never, oh, the Ministry of Health is doing a great job. It's, no, Leila at the Ministry of Health is someone I actually trust, and Sally at Oxfam is someone who's actually delivering. So it's about finding people who you can structure the partnership around. And then context matters in the sense that all these variables change in different contexts. Like the example I gave was that in different countries, they trusted the public sector, and in different countries, they trusted the private sector. So it's important not to copy paste things into different contexts, but you really need to tailor. And that all these things evolve over time, and you need to factor that in, and that communication was such a strong factor in making these things possible. So to think a little bit bigger than just supporting the small and medium enterprises and the social entrepreneurs like we have been to date, there are formal channels and formal structures that we can use to engage the government in development activities led by the civil and private sector in a way that holds the government accountable for future development work, and in a way that strengthens the capacity and resources of the government, but not going into this bottomless pit where you don't see the social return, where the social return and the social impact is contingent on the government working together with the private sector and with the civic sector. So I really think that if venture philanthropy and if private sector funding is going to be part of this future in Lebanon, then it needs to be through these forms of partnerships and mechanisms that hold all the different sectors accountable for aligning and working together.
Thank you so much. We have so many questions, and unfortunately, just a few minutes. I'm just gonna, I think we may need a second session, frankly, but I'm just gonna, one last question I see here from Hani Muwafi. What do you all believe is the mechanism for increasing transparency in Lebanon? Transparency is needed if free market approaches are preferred. Do you think it is possible, or is the country headed for more upheaval? Anybody wants to take that question on? Transparency.
I can start.
Go ahead, Sally.
And then maybe Khalil, you want to build. I mean, in the aftermath of the Beirut response, there's a lot of this discussion now, the shift from sort of relief and emergency response to recovery and reconstruction. And obviously reconstruction requires significant financing, and it's not necessarily something that is going to be able to be implemented by non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. You require a government partner here. And so one mechanism for us to really try to manage and address any form sort of corruption that comes with any potential reconstruction aid that comes to Lebanon, and this aid right now hasn't been pledged, just to be clear, because the condition is that a specific number of reforms take place. But assuming we're in a situation where a number of reforms do take place and we're starting to see reconstruction money pledged and trickle into the country, it's important to have an independent oversight body to oversee this, the financing of this reconstruction. One that we can really truly consider as independent and one that's civil society led. A few other options is promoting and continuing to really promote an independent judiciary, one that you can trust and go with your grievances. And continuing to protect the civil society space that can hold the government to account, because what we're seeing is yes, the government is absent from sort of all of its responsibilities, but yet it's cracking down on freedom of speech and activists and civil rights and civil society organizations. So this needs to be this space of the civic space needs to be protected. And as there's, given the dire economic situation, as we are sort of, and we're looking at extreme poverty rates, and the conversation around social protection has become front and center. And here I'm talking about social assistance, social insurance, as examples to address specific shocks and life cycle needs of individuals. That you can't develop such a framework and such a comprehensive strategy without a rights-based approach and inclusive and comprehensive, but one that really embeds certain anti-corruption measures, such as potentially a third-party monitoring group or a grievance and redress mechanisms, regular financial audits, among other specific interventions that can be designed in this. And let's not forget the humanitarian situation of Syrian refugees, and to continue to protect that space for a large community that that is not going anywhere anytime soon, given the situation in Syria, and it is not safe for refugees to return. Resettlement is minimal, not even reaching barely 1%, and integration, proper integration into Lebanon is not really an option. So to continue to also protect that community and that space from the international community's money of going into the wrong hands, or specific human rights measures that are serving measures taken by the Lebanese government that are serving as push factors for Syrian refugees to prematurely go back to a country that is not deemed safe for them, but with very little options left for them. I tried to answer one of the questions at the same time in the answer.
Unfortunately, we are actually out of time, but I'm just going to ask each of you just spend maybe a minute, and what would be one takeaway from this discussion you would like the participants to have? And I can start with Teresa.
Okay, in a minute and under, my personal opinion, and I'd love to hear Sally and Khalil's take on this, is to stop waiting. I think that we do need, the only key we all agree is to invest in stronger government systems. That is the starting point for our discussion. But what we're observing as a venture philanthropy organization is that all the international funders and supporters are just waiting to know who to work with in the government. And I think that we need to get started in a way that is centered around the government and around leading change across all sectors. And I think that that's a way to hold the government accountable, is to invest in the public, private, and civic sector together.
Khalil, one takeaway from for the participants from this discussion, from your perspective.
I agree with Teresa. I think that I'm always trying to be positive. Lebanon survived a lot of crises, invasions, and war in the first 100 years. It's by itself formidable that Lebanon survived disintegration. So to build on this positiveness, I think that we need to emphasize the idea that the state is not a technical necessity. The state and state institutions, they are not technical necessity. Which what I mean by that is that with all the good efforts of private sector, personal initiatives, and CSOs, the state is still needed, and state institutions are still needed. So we shouldn't perceive the state to be something out of necessity. We need to deal with that. No, and what I mean, I want to elaborate on this idea by saying that already we say Lebanon is different states within one state, or a house with many mansions, as they say, right? But again, we shouldn't turn Lebanon into an NGO state in the middle of a failed state. That's something also is important. And one of the questions, if I said Lebanon is like Venezuela or Somalia, no, Lebanon is like Venezuela right now. Somalia is disintegrated. Lebanon hasn't been disintegrated, and this is fascinating for many observers. But at the same time, so this is my take. How we should perceive the state, not out of technical necessity, or at the same time, Lebanon, we shouldn't have another NGO state within the different states of Lebanon, hence or within these different failed states of Lebanon. And this is my take about this.
Thank you, Khalil. Sally, final comment from you.
Thanks. I mean, there's so much bad news in the world these days. There's no shortage of that for sure. But, you know, and the Beirut blast itself as a one-off event was extensively covered in the international media for an extensive period of time by media standards. But, you know, as we sort of go back and sort of normalize to the new norm post-blast and you know, sort of an additional factor to all of the deep structural issues that have existed in Lebanon for many years, and especially this past year, it's easy to forget about Lebanon. And my message would be is you know, to not forget about Lebanon. That although this is a very small state, and you know, maybe one can say maybe insignificant even in the grand scheme of things, and there's many wars and problems and poverty and suffering in the world, but the implications of a complete breakdown of Lebanon would be very severe, not just for the Lebanese people themselves, but for the other communities that are living on Lebanese territory, such as Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees, but to the region itself, a region that is itself plagued with war, inequality, displacement, poverty, and vulnerability. So let's not forget about Lebanon. And there is a lot of seeds that have been planted of potential hope that can be invested in for the future.
Thank you. I want to sincerely thank all the panelists for a wonderful discussion. Thank the Council of Middle East Studies for sponsoring this event. I'm sorry we were not able to answer all your questions, but hopefully we would have another session at some point. And we wish you all the best, and we wish much, much better days for Lebanon.
Thank you,
all.
Kaveh. Thank you,
Thank you
Sadi,
all.
Khalil.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thanks, Teresa. Thanks, Khalil.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for being